Hello, everybody. This is Pasha Marlowe. Welcome back to the Neuroqueering podcast. And I am here with one of my favorite people on the planet and the person who introduced me to the term neuroqueer. So, Dylan, this is all your fault. And I love you for it. Dylan Alter is a Choctaw and Jewish non-binary neurodivergent ADHD coach. They have led panels, discussion groups, and restorative justice circles for more than 20 years, often on topics related to queer identity and always for the purpose of creating greater mutual understanding and empathy. I have loved and adored Dylan since the day I saw them in a webinar and have never let them not answer my calls since, because I just think Dylan is an extraordinary human being. And I'm so honored that you're here.
Thank you, Pasha. Thank you, Pasha. The feeling is entirely mutual. I remember similarly thinking that you were just the bee's knees after you came to one of our webinar sessions at Queer ADHD. And I listened to a podcast that you did talking about, play and improv as part of ADHD support. And I was like, this is amazing. I remember just pacing, because of course I can't listen to a podcast without pacing. And just, like fist cheering the air, like, yes, this is amazing. Yes, we need humor and play in our ADHD support.
Yes, it's one of the favorite aspects of neuroqueering is that it's absolutely, it's serious, it's important, it's purposeful work. And it's also playful and pleasurable work. And if it isn't, then we're not engaged or potentially even in high vibration enough to do the work, right? Because it's
I completely agree. I mean, almost every ADHDer that I talk to, myself included, we've got these histories of just trying harder. We try so hard at all the things all the time. And we think if we're just meaner to ourselves or more disciplined, suddenly it'll work. Suddenly we'll keep that planner for more than a month.
Right.
And if it worked like that, it would have worked by now.
We've tried hard enough. Yes.
Right. And so often, we find greater success by following the path of less resistance, sort of getting out of the way in the right direction. Identifying like what we're moving towards naturally and meeting those needs.
Yes. Yes. Well, since you said neuroqueering, it's like all these synapses start firing up in my brain. I resonated with queer ADHD, which is how I ended up at that webinar. And it was right. I mean, just months after I came out even, and I was terrified to go to I just didn't even think I looked or presented queer enough to go to the webinar. And you held such beautiful safe space for me to, I think you pretty much said, you were queer enough, you were all queer enough, you were all ADHD enough, everyone is welcome. And it calmed my nerves right away. And then later, when you expanded to your neuroqueer.org, do I have that right? I saw the word and then I read about it. And then it just something clicked in me that this is not only important to me as an identity for me as I identify as neuroqueer now, and I just feel like I'm neuroqueering all day long about every neuroqueering education, neuroqueering parenting. I'm neuroqueering all conversations about everything. And it feels expansive. And I've been missing that because frankly, ADHD coaching in and of itself was feeling anything from boring to stagnant to restrictive in and of itself. So I love the expansiveness of it. And I so appreciate you introducing me to the word neuroqueer and Nick Walker's work with neuroqueer heresies, her book and your work. I'm so appreciative. So yes, thank you.
I'm so glad. I mean, it's such an exciting time right now in the field. The field of neurodivergent support, the field of neuroscience generally right now is sort of realizing that the way we thought the brain worked is maybe not the way the brain works.
Right.
And wonderfully, queer theory has laid this incredible groundwork, learning from, critical race theory and feminist theory, of how to carve out space for ourselves, how to unpack these systems of oppression and these power dynamics and these ideas of what we're supposed to be, that end up restricting us and not making space for who we actually are,
Yes.
and how to put that down.
Yeah. Yeah. And prior to recording, we were saying how this is a cultural and a cultural issue, and that we're really trying to navigate who we are in ourselves and in our institutions and in our culture at large. It's a really fascinating time. You're right. And there's still so much change every day within the field of neurodiversity, and controversy in how we treat it or pathologize it or speak about it. So yeah, it feels very new. And I just want to say out loud again to the audience, the listeners, that I'm not fully understanding the idea of neuroqueering, and I might never fully understand it. And I was terrified to start this podcast until I fully understood it. And yet part of neuroqueering is being curious and being creative and delving into conversations with people like Dylan and just like kind of trading ideas and sharing concepts and then working off each other's energy in a serious way, but also playful way. And then just thinking outside the box and questioning kind of everything. Right. And so it's messy. And so it will be messy.
Love that. I love that.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for your willingness to be vulnerable in that way, and the bravery that you have for doing this, because that perfectionist culture. I mean,
Yeah.
number one, a lot of ADHDers, we struggle with perfectionism because it's a way of making us feel like we have control in a really chaotic existence. But it's so restrictive, and this perfectionist culture basically tells us that we can't participate, we can't engage, we can't explore for fear that we won't do it right, and it doesn't give us much of a learning curve. And so I want to invite folks who might be listening, what would it be like, what would it do for you if you could put down the anxiety that making a mistake was a bad thing or would be judged? If you could trust that neurodivergent compassion that you have cultivated of watching other people and trying to figure out how they do the things they do and why they do the things they do. And you could trust that if you made a mistake that did harm, that you cared and that you would be able to show up to repair. And that then your mistakes could be opportunities to learn and do better. That you could really hold on to your mistakes, that you could treasure them and use them rather than be afraid of ever making them. Because I think that that's not only a gift that we have in neurodivergent community, but also an opportunity that we have to create neurodivergent culture, which is something we've never done before, because up until the last few years before the pandemic, there wasn't really as much connection between neurodivergent folks in the way that there are. Now there's communities popping up all over the place, and we really sort of have, for the first time, a really expansive sort of modern neurodivergent anthropology that we're seeing. And I don't know how that happens without making mistakes, but I'm excited.
Right. Yes, I'm excited about it too. And when you were talking, I was thinking about how we all came to this place. And for a lot of us, that was throughout the pandemic, perhaps listening to more podcasts or reading more articles or watching more videos and then seeing ourselves in them, but not really understanding the language or the implications. And then we started to put it all together. And there's so much about self-diagnoses and getting diagnosed and that process and how it's, I mean, it's expensive, it's prohibitive, it's hard to, some people are waiting years to get diagnosed. What is your feeling about access to diagnoses and self-diagnoses?
Yeah. Diagnosis is currently in the United States is it's got that sort of like dark Shakespearean like irony of how much executive function it takes to get
Yes,
diagnosed with executive function disorder.
absolutely.
You
Yeah.
know, it's wildly inaccessible to most folks.
Yes.
And you know, I saw a meme about ADHD in the pandemic the other day. It was like, I always thought that if I had enough time to do everything, that I'd be able to catch up on everything. Well, pandemic happened, and it turns out it wasn't that. So many of us got diagnosed, you know, during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And just having that opportunity to reflect and notice the patterns that were there, even when the rest of daily life stopped.
Yes.
And so with that, I think we've seen a massive influx in the number of cisgender women who have realized that they have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, you know, the primary population for ADHD was, you know, white, Western, cisgender male children.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't even think that adult ADHD was really a thing for most people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my personal theory on that, which I've mentioned elsewhere, is that, you know, male children grew up and got girlfriends and secretaries and wives who had been socialized to take care of their executive function. And so the symptoms of ADHD for those cisgender white Western men went away. And we thought that adult ADHD wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that now we know, right, that cisgender girl children present as inattentive. And interestingly, most adults who present as impulsive as children then become inattentive as they get older. As we grow up, we internalize that impulsivity.
From the mask.
And what neuroqueer theory makes me wonder there is that masking? Is at least some of inattentive ADHD a process of internalizing, a process of masking, responding to that cultural pressure? You know, and is there, you know, genuine, unique, inattentive ADHD? I think that there probably is. There's descriptions of that behavior in other cultures. In Brazil, there's a term called nefetilabada, I think. My Portuguese is atrocious. But it means the person who's just sort of like off in their own head and daydreaming and wandering around the clouds. Yeah. And it's a non-gendered term. But the you know, with the awareness that, you know, ADHD is an issue for cisgender women, now we're getting into the phase where, you know, ADHD is being presented as very gendered. We're sort of in the men are from Mars, women are from Venus era of ADHD.
That's interesting.
You know, and the idea that there's like a left hemisphere of the brain and a right hemisphere of the brain, and one does art and one does math. Very that's binary. Not how these sort of these false dichotomies.
Yes.
You know, and with divergence, which queer theory is a theory of diverging from the norm. And you know, first we go from a single, then we go to a binary, and then we go to beyond the binary. And I think that's sort of where we might be going with ADHD and neurodivergence generally.
Yeah.
Maybe, who knows?
Neurofluidity is a term I've heard recently.
I hadn't heard that.
I like it. Like you said, it's a spectrum, just like you had mentioned the Kinsey scale. Yeah. You know, nobody's probably all straight. And likewise, there's no one normal right brain. And so in this neurofluidity, the idea that, you know, we're all somewhere along this beautiful spectrum.
Yeah, and that brings up a really interesting, you know, aspect of, you know, that there's a link between queerness and neurodivergence in this, fluidity that you brought up. In that, Dr. Nick Walker talks about the, neuroplasticity and the ways that, there's no such thing as a typical brain. Right. If anybody had a normal brain, it would be the weird one in the bunch. And that all of our brains, our nervous systems are constantly responding to our experiences, and shifting a little bit, throughout our lives. It changes. That's normal. It has to. And, so much of the arguments that I see in, around, trans youth are, well, what if they made a mistake? What if they're not really trans?
Right.
They can change. What is so terrifying about having to make a change?
Yes. And when you bring up the trans community, it reminds me of a term that shows up that's dysphoria. And I bring it up because it shows up in gender dysphoria. And it also, I hear it with things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is a popular term in the ADHD community as a symptom of ADHD, but it still feels very pathologizing to me, even though dysphoria means unbearable, not disordered. It feels like that because of the way gender dysphoria has been pathologized. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I wonder about that one. I grapple with that one. I mean, the rejection sensitive dysphoria, I really wonder if that is its own, sort of unique, sort of baked in neurological thing. We're definitely, noticing the way that emotional regulation is different for ADHDers, the ways that, the prefrontal cortex just sort of takes the emotion coming from the limbic system, up through the dopamine pathways and just sort of lets the whole emotion. We feel all the feelings, not just what's appropriate for the moment. Yes. But when you add on, trauma theory, which the queer community has just, dove into. Yes. We're elbows deep in trauma theory. We're like, this explains so much. Yes. And you look at the experience of growing up neurodivergent and not knowing it, how often one of the first signs is peer rejection, as a child, and how many more, negative messages we get as children, and how isolating it is, and how that, often leads to suicide or self-harm or, isolation, all of these, really painful experiences. Yes. And I have to wonder, like, does that RSD seem out of context, or does that seem like a reasonable response? I am with you on this. It's not a popular opinion, but yes, the part of RSD for listeners, rejection sensitive or sensitivity dysphoria, depending on who you're talking to, is that there's real an emotional or physical reaction to real or perceived rejection. And there's this emphasis on the perceived, like, oh, we're just perceiving it because, we have a lot of this internalized shame. And of course we do, because it's actual rejection, because the perceived rejection is based on actual rejection based in trauma that we've it's like, to me, I can't separate the two. Yeah. Right. Exactly. I mean, there are a lot of, social psychology studies on how painful it is to feel excluded from your community, excluded from your group, excluded from your family. Well, biologically, in a herd of animals, you die if you're excluded or rejected. Right. You're right. And I'm not dead. Exactly. It's a really severe trauma. And I'm not saying in that we've been given the tools to learn how to manage our emotions. Even today, most neurodivergent support in terms of emotional regulation, the regulation often translates to numb it out or just control it. Right, more drugs. Right, or mindfulness in a way where we're just compartmentalizing it and boxing it away for fear of, scaring or upsetting or inconveniencing other people who don't experience emotions the way we do.
Yes. Yes.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore how to, engage in our emotional experiences in ways that feel authentic, and also don't cause harm.
Exactly.
But I haven't seen a lot of exploration of that yet.
Yeah, and that again just reminds me of the Audre Lorde work on the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So I think about in what you're saying in our embodiment of our neurodivergence, in our stimming, in our being out loud with our neurodivergence in a way that society is not used to seeing, but it is of no harm to ourselves or others. It makes potentially people uncomfortable. And I feel like that's part of the path to dismantling it and becoming more free of it, so that we, and if more of us unmask and fully embody when we feel safe to do so, I hope that opens up the opportunity for more authenticity and freedom and fluidity and voices to be heard.
Absolutely.
It's my dream.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly a time and a place for masking. Like masking is something that keeps us safe, is something that can get us access to jobs. Masking is a tool, and it's not always a bad one. It's definitely something that anybody who's a member of an oppressed group likely is very, very aware of that process of masking, of sort of intercultural diplomacy. And also I think that neurodivergence is something that has been around for thousands and thousands of years. I think I sent you one when I went down that rabbit hole of like trying to find the first description of neurodivergence.
I loved you for this. You're finding the Latin root for words, and it's like, where are you going with this? But then you kept going and going and going, and ever since you did that, I find myself, you could go way back into like all the roots and all the it was fascinating, and I was like, there's I love your brain.
Thank you. I mean, sometimes it's a bit much for even me, but yeah, I was just digging. I was,
hours
going down that rabbit hole, and I was so delighted I could share it with you.
Yes.
Like, I want like a neurodivergent specific term for the joy of getting to share something you found down a rabbit hole with somebody else, with that excitement.
Different than euphoria. Is that not enough?
It's sort of euphoria. It's somebody, I saw on a TikTok, there's this term called penguin pebbling. Of like I'm a neurodivergent person, and I found this thing and I thought you would like it, so I'm going to hand you this pebble. Which is apparently something that penguins do.
That's adorable.
But I found this definition that goes back to 300 BC Greece, from the protege of Aristotle, describing this person who's called, the direct translation was the anesthetized man, the man who feels differently.
Yes.
But it was translated by somebody in France to be the obtuse man, or like the stupid man. But it doesn't read like that at all. And the descriptions are so very classically ADHD.
Yes.
I strongly encourage anybody to read it. But now I'm wondering, like, where in like other cultures' mythology do we have models of neurodivergence that was accepted? Like, I wonder how many Native American tribes myths around coyote are an expression of neurodivergence. This sort of like very, very present, very random ideas and creative ideas about, I'm going to do this or this other thing over here, and I'm going to make mistakes and mess things up, but in a good-hearted way, mostly. Sort of character. Am I projecting? Is it a symbol of neurodivergence? I'm not sure, but I think it's a
Mm.
really interesting line of inquiry.
Yes, I'm thinking about artists like Michelangelo or minds like Einstein, and how in
Yeah,
different cultures it was revered. Or I'm thinking about like witches and their intuition and perceptiveness and
right. Apparently,
yeah.
sorcerer used to be a 14th century slang for queer.
Mm.
This person who lived out in the woods and knew all of these strange habits and had these strange habits and hobbies and knew a lot about a lot of different things, and like, oh, maybe neuroqueer. And Leonardo da Vinci, widely acknowledged as queer, had
Hmm.
so many projects, never finished one.
Never been
um, was still brilliant, wrote
so
upside and
neuroqueer.
backwards. I think the argument could be made.
It's for sure. This would be a fascinating study and something that you should do in your spare time.
Right. My next
Please,
rabbit hole. Yeah.
please rabbit hole for us.